Jesus 911, we're talking to Arturo Ortiz. He wrote a book. It's called The Ten Commandments Simplified and Explained. We're going to be putting a picture of the book right on the screen right now, so you can take a look at the book and you can order the book. This is a very timely book because I'll tell you, most people don't realize that the Ten Commandments was given to us by God for everybody, not just for the Jews. It's for everybody. And some people may say, well, I don't know the Ten Commandments. I haven't memorized them. Well, the Ten Commandments have been put in your heart as well. It's called the natural law. St. Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. And so I just got a challenge to everybody who's listening to the show today. Memorize the Ten Commandments. If you don't know them, print them out, put them on your refrigerator, put them in your bedroom, on the mirror when you brush your teeth in the morning or you shave. And just put a copy of the Ten Commandments there. Recite them every day in your morning prayer or your evening prayer until you memorize them. It's simple. You'll memorize them in 2 or 3 days, and then you'll remember them for the rest of your life. So Arturo, tell us. You're telling us a little bit about your professional background, and once you share that, then tell us a little bit about. Give us a working definition or a basic definition of what is the natural law. But tell us a little bit about your professional background. Then give us a definition on what is the natural law.
Yeah. So my professional background, as we mentioned in the beginning, I do have a bachelor's degree in history from Cal State Fullerton, kind of trying to work towards either a philosophy or theology degree from Holy Apostles. And then apart from that, a lot of it's just self-education since I was 18, since I came back to the faith. And just reading a lot of the writings of the church, but like the catechism, various councils of the church, encyclicals, but also with a specific emphasis on the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, as well as Aristotle, which I think both go hand in hand specifically with the topic of natural law. Since, Aquinas writes about theology, but he also writes a lot about the nature of God and his working creation. So I think that's where the definition, or where we can derive the concept of the natural law. I think I mentioned briefly in the beginning that there's 3 types of laws that exist in God. And in general, I think it's good to point out that the word law, as Aquinas says, the word law, it's something that it's an ordinance of human reason, or an ordinance of reason that is emanated by the person in authority. So God, it's being in reality itself, and within himself there are 3 laws that exist. The first one, it's God's eternal law, which is just divine providence. It's divine positive law, which is his revealed salvation history, and which can only be known by him revealing himself. And lastly, the natural law, which is man's nature's participation in the eternal law, which is itself a participation in the mind of God. So the natural law is tied to something's nature, and says that, so we all have natures. Whether it be something like human nature, or even a clock, which we create, which we would call a human artifact. Everything. So humans are, or the nature of humans is that we are rational. That's what makes us human. The concept of a clock is to tell time. And we can say that everything else has its proper nature. The natural law is concerned with fulfilling our nature, and it's particularly interested in the concept of animated beings, such as plants, animals, and human beings. And I would say with a specific emphasis on humans, since not only are we animated, but we are rational. We can think and we can abstract concepts. So in order for an animal or a human to survive, for example, we need to eat, since eating is the means which sustains us. If we don't eat, we are frustrating our nature. This goes with a lot of other things, such as our sexual as well as our intellectual kind of aspects of our nature. They are all directed to a specific end, such as truth in regard to our intellect, and reproduction and union in marriage between a male and a female in regard to sex. So I would say this is specifically in a nutshell what the natural law entails.
So, what are some of the sources for the natural law? I think that you just
Yeah,
mentioned right now. What are some of the sources?
yeah. So there's various kind of primary as well as other secondary sources that touch upon the natural law. The primary sources I would go with Aristotle and his Ethics, Aquinas, both in his commentary to Aristotle's Ethics, as well as his Summa Theologica, as well as his Summa Contra Gentiles. Um, the Bible in Romans 2, which mentions that the natural law is written in the heart. And in secondary sources, there's like the Catholic Encyclopedia, which has a plethora of sources touching upon the natural law in one way or another, including lying in regards to our sexual and intellectual appetite. I would read the works by Dr. Edward Facer as well as Dr. Buczynski. I would say these are some of like the best sources I've seen.
Let me ask you a question. 500 years ago, the Aztecs in what's called Mexico now, they didn't have access to the Ten Commandments. They didn't have access to a Bible. They didn't have access to a catechism. Yet they practiced cannibalism. They practiced open sodomy. It was a homosexual culture. They practiced human sacrifice in the pyramids. So they obviously they didn't go through an RCIA program. They didn't have the benefit of reading the 10 Commandments 1 to 10. Do you believe that the Aztecs knew that what they were doing was wrong, or was it just part of the culture that they grew up in? So there would be no culpability, no sin in what they're doing, or would you say that they were guilty and they're without excuse because of the natural law?
I would go with the latter because the natural law reveals these things. I would say a lot of the depravity, let's say like in how you mentioned in regards to the Aztecs or even Carthaginian culture, it's, they might know, well, the natural law is knowable, so they could have known it. A lot of it has to do with the nature of sin, specifically since they, apart from like the Jewish and, our Christian Catholic culture, they didn't have the sacraments. So with that, obviously, even though they could have known the natural law, and some of them obviously did, from an individual perspective, I would say the absence of, they live in a fallen human nature. So, and then specifically with the absence of the sacraments, even though it's possible to know the natural law, it's much, much harder. Aquinas says perhaps even impossible if you don't have any grace in general. With that being said, I would say that this actually touches into one of the chapters of the book that I wrote in regards to how it's part of the nature of the natural law that we ought to worship God. So the very fact that, let's say Carthaginian and even the Aztec cultures, which were removed from kind of the European culture, so they didn't have any contact with, Jewish or in the Old Testament. Nevertheless, they, and the Catechism mentions that throughout history in general, man has been a religious being. So the very fact that they offered sacrifice, even human sacrifice, as depraved as it was, at least they had some implicit knowledge that they needed to sacrifice. And specifically, in the Aztec and even I believe the Carthaginian culture, the kind of the mythos or the idea was that if you stop doing sacrifice, such as human sacrifice, it throws the created order into disarray. So obviously they didn't have the benefit of revealed religion and as to what true sacrifice was, but they still had an implicit knowledge that sacrifice in general was demanded by God, even though it was depraved in the way they were doing it.
It's interesting, Arturo. You mentioned that even people who are baptized Catholics, say like the Italian mafia, they the true religion has been revealed to them, the ones that are Catholics. And I say that because a couple of years ago, I was talking to about a 90-year-old priest from Chicago. And he told me, he was already in his mid-90s. He told me that he was ordained a priest around the age of 20, 24, 25. And he told me that he was a young priest in Chicago under the reign of Al Capone, who was one of the most famous mobsters in Chicago for the Italian mafia, the La Cosa Nostra. And he told me, this old priest, he's like 95, he said, Jess, Al Capone, although he was a very bad man, he did understand the natural law, because if he didn't like you, or if you double crossed him but he liked you, he would pick you up in a limousine. He would have a priest in the back seat, and he would have the priest hear your confession. Then they would drop the priest off at the rectory, and then Al Capone and his mob, they would go and execute you after they allowed you to go to confession to a Catholic priest. This was back in the 40s and 50s. He said, but if Al Capone didn't like you, what he would do is he would rent a room for you in a 5-star hotel. He'd get you a hooker, and he'd put all kinds of drugs and alcohol in the room, and he would say, hey, you've done a good job. I just want to give you a little reward this weekend. Go to room such and such. Here's your key. And Al Capone would tell his hitmen, give the guy 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, he'll be naked with the hooker. Kick the door down, put a gun to his head, and shoot him in the head and tell him right before, Al Capone says you die in mortal sin, and execute him. So even Al Capone and his demented, unevangelized, lukewarm criminal mentality, he knew the 10 commandments. He knew about, thou shalt, the 6th and 9th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. He knew the consequences of spurning God's law and dying in mortal sin. He made sure he sent his enemies to hell. But having said that, let me ask you, how can the notion of the natural law help us in sharing our Catholic faith with others?
Yeah, of course. And then right before I answered that question, I think you actually brought a good point, because, I think you mentioned it, that before the 50s, all government buildings, or almost all of them, had the 10 Commandments displaced. And I think one of the fallacious arguments in its removal was specifically in regards to, how it affects the Establishment Clause about promoting religion. And then I've heard this even from like priests or just Catholics in general. But if you really think about it, since the 10 Commandments are part of the natural law, you're actually just promoting the natural law revealed religion or natural reason. So it's not, it would be different saying, let's say, all government buildings having a placard that, that show the perpetual virginity of Mary or the divinity of Christ. But the natural law presupposes the 10 Commandments. And yeah, I bring that up specifically for the next question you asked me, which is, how can the natural law help us in sharing our faith? And I would argue that it can help us in the same way that studying natural theology or philosophy applied to the natural knowledge of God, the natural proofs for the existence of God and His creation can help us. This is true regarding, let's say, the school associated with Thomism or St. Thomas Aquinas. Studying the natural law and studying natural theology helps us to make sense of God and His commandments. This is true in regards to St. Anselm's quote, faith-seeking understanding. God is free to do as He pleases, but He is also infinitely true and good. What this means is that things are not good because God does them, although they do derive their goodness from Him. But God fundamentally does things because they are good. What this means is that God has a rational plan that includes everything in it, ranging from the existence of things to grace, predestination, and any other thing. Knowing God's rational plan for reality itself and the plan that is included in it helps us to have a much better understanding of the faith, but also of why God created us. And so I would say that this can also help us in evangelizing others by showing God's goodness and order in creation.
Let me ask you a question, Arturo. Give me some examples of how some commandments are purely based on natural law.
Yeah, so there's a few cases specifically that or concrete commandments that I can think of. One of them is obviously, as we mentioned, in regards to kind of the sixth and ninth commandment in regards to sex. Scripture makes it clear that God's creation is good. This is throughout just the first chapter of Genesis. There's about 4 or 5 or even more times where it says God looked at what He created, and behold, it was not only good but very good. And so the question is, why do people engage in sex? It can't just be for pleasure, since pleasure doesn't define something as good. Rather, something is pleasurable insofar as it is good. And so God created or the sexual aspect of our nature for it to be both procreative as well as unitive, specifically in the context of marriage between a male and a female. Since this is the only natural way in which you can have kids, but also Aristotle says that a friendship and love, a friendship is an excess of love. And C.S. Lewis expands on this in showing that marriage is of such a nature that it is exclusive to a male and a female. But going back to a thing being pleasurable versus good, a thing is pleasurable to get us to want to engage in that activity. Food tastes good in order to get us to eat, which is required for our sustenance. Sex is likewise pleasurable to get us to engage in it, but the goodness of something, it's the end to which something is directed. Sexual activity, as we mentioned, is directed towards reproduction and union between a husband and a wife. I would say this is true in regards to the commandment and in regards to lying as well. Our intellects are ordered towards the giving of, or they're ordered towards truth. A lie is a deprivation because it is telling a falsehood to someone who is entitled to the truth. Stealing is likewise contrary to the natural law, for there is the existence of private property, which is the origins, as Pope Leo XIII and the natural law tradition explains. It's God, or it's humans participating in their intellectual nature and bringing about something from substances that God created, but we are making something new out of them. So, and then we get things either by creating it or purchasing it from someone else that created it with our money. So stealing is contrary to the natural law because it's taking someone's natural possession. I would say these are some of the concrete ways by which you can see how, basically all of the 10 commandments are based on just natural revelation from God.
Let me ask you a question. How does this tie into marriage and the purpose of our sexual faculties?
Yeah, so this goes furthermore in regards to what we mentioned. So marriage itself, Aristotle says that a friendship is specifically an excess of love. So to go deeper, he kind of breaks this down into different types of friendship. There is in its most basic level, there's what you could define as a business relationship, which is just all friendships are based on a good. A business partnership, it's based on a union of persons just to engage in some type of kind of a practical good. But the highest form of friendship, the more intimate the friendship, the more exclusive it becomes. And this is where C.S. Lewis in his chapter on the Four Loves goes into showing the difference between Venus, which is kind of or sexual pleasure, and eros, which is a direct sexual pleasure in regards to the good. And so the purpose of marriage is both to unite the spouses but it is furthermore to be reproductive and to bring forth children, both into this world and furthermore as a Christian into the kingdom of God.
Arturo, you touched on it a little bit, but I want you to just kind of repeat what you said. Explain the difference between a lie and mental reservation. Like, for example, if the Germans come over to your house in 1940 and you're hiding some Nazis in your basement, and they say, Arturo Ortiz, we hear that you got some Nazis in your basement. Yeah. And you say, Mr. Third Reich, Mr. SS soldiers, no, nobody's there. The house is empty. And then they leave. Well, you lied to the SS, to the secret police of Hitler, but you saved a bunch of Jews that were in your basement from being gassed. So tell us the difference between a lie and mental reservation.
Yeah, so I feel like that's kind of the argument that almost everyone brings in regards to a lie. And I feel that a lot of people that bring about the example that you just gave try to do it, or I feel like a lot of them might honestly be confused, but I think a lot of them also kind of try to trap you into justifying, a lie. So all lies are bad. A lie is something said that differs from what one is thinking about, or which conveys a message that is not in conformity with what reality is. But it should be noted that the person at hand also has a right to that information. So in a lie, there's a discrepancy from what is being said and the thing at hand. But I mentioned how all lies are bad because it's based both on people that have a right to the information, and it's also saying something that differs from what you're actually thinking, or that is different from external circumstances. Now, it should be said, for example, in a mental reservation, it's a means of speaking equivocally, which simply means there's multiple true meanings, as opposed to univocally, where there's only one meaning. But the other thing, it's an example of the Nazis that a lot of people bring up, whether because they're trying to understand what a lie is, or they're trying to trap you into justifying a lie. In regards to someone breaking into your house, trying to murder, let's say, an innocent Jewish man or any other person you may be hiding, what they're asking you when they're saying if you have a friend in your house, there's actually a spoken request and an unspoken request. The spoken request is there someone in your house, but the unspoken request they're actually asking you is so that we may murder an innocent man. So if you say no, you're actually not lying, both because they're not entitled to that information, as well as the fact that what you're saying no to, it's not, first and foremost, maybe he's not even there physically anymore. Maybe he ran into the backyard or whatnot. But the other thing is you're actually also saying no to their unspoken request, which is that we may murder him, which they don't have any right to. So I would say this is where the difference between a mental reservation. You're not lying because they're not entitled to the information, but you're also speaking in a way that is equivocal and can have multiple true meanings, as well as you're saying you're kind of also looking at someone's unspoken request that is in of itself sinful, and you're denying that.
I like that. Yeah, you're denying somebody's sinful request. That's good. So how is abortion and euthanasia opposed to the natural law?
Yeah, so I would so in regards to this is because God is the author of human life. And so to kind of bring about, a lot of people are kind of scandalized when they read scripture and, God commanding the death of all the Amalekites and even, I think the women, children or whatnot. But the thing to understand is that God is the author of human life, and only he has the right to take our life in whatever way he sees fit. But only he has that right because God gave us life. We didn't give ourselves life, nor did we give someone else life. So, something like abortion is obviously contrary to natural law for the same way murder is, since abortion is murder. Murder is the innocent it's the killing of an innocent person, whether done by an individual or unlawfully by a state, killing someone that was actually proven to be innocent. Abortion as the killing of a conceived being in the womb, namely a fetus, which is a living organism independent of the mother. It is a baby, even though it has not been born, it is already conceived, and it is the life is independent of the mother. Likewise, euthanasia, like suicide, we don't have the right to take our own life. Obviously, that's not to say there aren't circumstances that diminish our culpability. A lot of in regards to this, it's in regards to, and even abortion, a lot of it's the husband or a family member pressuring someone to commit suicide or euthanasia or abortion. But it doesn't do away with the objectivity of the action itself, which is that only God has the right to take life away or to give life. That's why even things like in vitro conception is contrary to natural law, because even though it's scientifically possible to bring about life in some type of circumstance that is kind of like in a petri dish or just kind of like a controlled environment, the thing people need to understand is that just because something is possible, whether scientifically or physically, doesn't bring about a moral right to do so.
Arturo, this is kind of a big one. The Protestants and the Catholics, we have kind of a different set of 10 commandments. The abbreviated form of 10 commandments, we abbreviate them differently. The Protestants, they have the 9th and 10th commandment together, and we as Catholics, we separate the 9th and 10th commandment. They seem similar, but the 9th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's spouse. 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's, donkey, horse, etc., or belongings. So what's the difference between the 9th and the 10th commandments, since they seem similar, since both of them say do not covet? In other words, do not desire something that's not yours.
Yeah. So in order, I'll answer that, and then just kind of a brief note. I actually just recently saw that the reason that the Protestant and Orthodox have the same 10 commandments and the Catholics have a different set, it simply has to do with the breakdown of, so we use St. Augustine's breaking down of the 10 commandments, whereas Protestants, which is funny because what they're actually using, it's Origins, which is a early church fathers breaking down of the 10 commandments. So when Protestants are like, oh, you're using the wrong 10 commandments, or even if we say they're using the wrong 10 commandments, they're both, fine. So obviously, like, I just say that because they were both early church fathers. But to get back into the question, it's specifically the 9th and the 10th commandments both have the way I phrased it is they both have the same genus, but they have a different species. The genus that they share, it's in regards to sins of the thought or desires. And the species, or what makes them different, it's the object that they have in mind. The 9th commandment has to do with disordered desires in regards to our sexual appetite, whereas the 10th commandment, it's specifically concerned with the object of greed and avarice. So I would say that's what makes them similar and different from each other. So things like modesty, chastity, all of these have to do with the 9th commandment, whereas avarice, envy have to do with the 10th commandment.
And Protestants, they conflate both of them. They almost make the spouse equal to property and possessions, whereas Catholics, we see a distinction. We use St. Augustine's abbreviation, where there's definitely a distinction between coveting somebody else's spouse and coveting somebody else's car. There's a big distinction between a human person and an object, and the Protestants, they conflate both in their abbreviated form. And by the way, Origen fell into heresy in his later years. We call it the heresy of Origenism, where he started promoting, universal salvation, that at the end of somebody's life, that everybody will be saved at the end, even demons. So, you definitely don't want to use Origen as your source. We'd rather use St. Augustine. So, Arturo, where can people go to find more of your work?
The main area right now, it's a website I started not too long ago, splendidtruth.com, and then also my YouTube channel with the same name. I'm trying to do a lot more research to hopefully come up with more content. I have videos and articles, and hopefully I'll be able to do more books sometime soon as well.
Well, I hope also that you put yourself in a position as a Catholic teacher. We need good Catholic teachers out there in our high schools and our middle schools and even colleges. I hope that's somewhere in your future, because you got a good mind, brother. And
thank you.
And we need good teachers, because we have a lot of bad teachers right now.
Yeah.
I don't want to be negative, but we do. And so you're on the right side of all the issues. So how can people get a hold of your book, Arturo?
Right now, the main one, it's Amazon.com. So I have both a Kindle and a paperback that they can get. And once again, just the name of the book is The 10 Commandments Simplified and Explained.
So you got about a minute left. What would you like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I would say definitely, if you're interested in knowing the faith, specifically from an intellectual perspective, and especially St. Thomas Aquinas sometimes can feel intimidating to people. So there's a book I would recommend if people want a kind of an easy intro to the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, and that's Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide by Dr. Edward Facer. It's a very short book, and I feel like once you read that, and maybe perhaps read Aristotle and his ethics, St. Thomas Aquinas will become much more of a breeze to read.
Yeah. The last thing I would say is this about the 10 Commandments. They're a summary of the natural law that God has placed in the human heart. And so everybody, Jew and Gentile, we will be without excuse at our particular judgment, according to St. Paul. And I think the reason, Arturo, that a lot of people can't apprehend the natural law that God has placed in the human heart is because of sin. We know that sin, it darkens the intellect. We know that sin weakens the will. In other words, to make it very simple, sin makes you stupid. And so, as a result of sin, we can't see the obvious. Any comments about that?
No, yeah, I completely agree. So one has to do with kind of knowing things naturally, but also you need to be free of all sin, both mortal and trying to strive not for venial. So the closer you are to the sacraments, to confession, the more you receive the Eucharist and adoration. I remember Fulton Sheen said that when people heard him speak, it wasn't him speaking, but God speaking through him from all the holy hours he did in adoration.
Wow. Arturo, thank you very much, my friend.
Thank you.
Congratulations, and we'll have you on again.
Thank you.
Say hi to all the Brotherhood of St. Dismas out in Southern California. Give them my regards.
Sure will.
You got it.
Thanks for having me.